All right, maybe let's get started while everyone is getting seated. So I know it has been a long morning, and we have went through quite a lot of graphs and equations and math, and now we're going to switch our gear, and we're looking things from 1,000 miles away, top-down, macroeconomics and policy, and what kind of influence the computing little transistors or all the large language models may have on the grid, and how does the government, or how do we think about it from economics and policy side. So our second panel is power for AI. So we'll ask the question, how do we deliver power and ensure that the development of AI is sustainable? And our moderator is Professor Jenkins, who is an expert in macro system modeling and is famous for remaining models and thoughts, and a world thought leader on sustainability and energy systems. Please, Jesse.
Thanks, Minji. Thank you. So I'm very excited about this panel here. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, including Allison Clements, who is just recently on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the chief energy regulator for the US. We have Matt DeNichilo, who is with ECP, which is a major equity investor across a variety of energy generation technologies and companies. And Lucia Tian, who is on the climate ops team at Google, which is tasked with trying to provide the clean energy needed to power their data centers. So the perfect group to have this conversation. Before we jump into what will be a moderated discussion, I wanted to just provide a bit of context about the scale of electricity demand growth that we're facing and put the data centers as a piece of that into the overall context. So the key here is that we are, for decades since we invented electricity, demand for electricity was growing steadily at a pace that far outstripped overall GDP growth. And that actually continued through the 1980s and 1990s and into the mid-2000s, where demand for electricity was growing by about 2.4% per year on an average basis, a little bit ahead of GDP during that period. And that's actually the slowest period of growth. If you go back to the 1920s and 30s, demand was growing at something like 12 or 13% per year. So for decades, the electricity sector was used to growth. It was its primary mode. How do we deliver the energy we need to power growing economies and new economic activities? Then in the mid-2000s, something fundamentally changed. And for the last generation, effectively, the last 20 years or so, demand for electricity in the United States has effectively been flat. We've had demand growth that is roughly 0.5% per year on average, effectively plateaued since 2005 through 2022. Variety of factors behind this, probably the sort of growing, the growth of retail services and financial services and other less energy intensive components of our economy during this period, accelerated globalization with the entrance of China into the WTO and its role as sort of the factory for the world, and a variety of energy efficiency policies and efforts that really accelerated during this period as well. What this means is that the whole sector in the United States has effectively gotten used to this sort of stagnant zero growth mentality. That's a very different mentality than what we need for where we're going now. Moving forward, we are going to enter in again to a period of sustained electricity demand growth. And this is not just about data centers, as I'll show you, although that is, I think, driving the conversation forward in a really important way right now. And in fact, our estimates from the REPEAT project, which is a project that I run to estimate the impact of federal energy policies on our energy future in the United States, is that demand for electricity over the next 10 or 15 years will grow by something like 2.4 to 3.8% per year. So on the upper end, close to 4% per year growth in electricity demand through 2035. That's coming from a diverse set of drivers, all right? So this is our 2030 demand here, where we expect something between a 15 and 24% overall growth in electricity demand relative to today's levels. Data centers are a big chunk of that. That's the blue chunk here, but by no means the majority of overall electricity demand. And by 2035, the overall growth could be something like 37 to 64% over today's levels. So think of it roughly as a half, growing half again from today's electricity demand. That's a very large increase. But again, data centers are a piece of this. Somewhere, we have a wide range of uncertainty, of course, about the total demand growth. But look at data centers in blue and compared to, say, hydrogen electrolysis in orange. Equally uncertain, but equally large potential consumer of electricity. The biggest chunk is likely to come from electric vehicles here. These are light duty and then medium and heavy duty vehicles, right? So the bigger drivers of electricity demand growth over the next 15 years are probably electrification of final energy uses today that depend on fossil fuels for transportation, for heating, or for industrial processes and chemicals production, right? So while data centers are critical, right, and I think are driving a lot of the conversation now, we really need to be in a much broader growth-oriented mindset in the electricity sector. And again, we have a generation of executives, of regulators, of investors, of technology companies, and others that are not used to this growth environment. And so I think this is a really fundamental shift. And one thing I'm hopeful for is that this conversation we're having now around how do we meet the needs of AI and of data center growth will focus the country on this broader challenge of how do we broadly meet the needs of an electrifying and growing economy with clean electricity so that we can do this while also driving down greenhouse gas emissions and staying on track for our climate targets. So again, if we look at the overall pie of electricity consumption in 2035, this is sort of the low estimate and the high estimate. Data centers are somewhere between 3 and 8% of overall electricity consumption in our estimates. That's up from about 2% today, so definitely growth. But again, it's not 50% or 40%, right? This is a piece of the pie. Hydrogen could be equally large, between 3 and 12%. And again, light and medium duty vehicles, probably on the order of 13% of our overall electricity consumption in 2035, up from like nothing today, right? Roughly 1%. So the bigger driver here is in vehicles. So I just wanted to provide that context. I think it's important as we think about how do we meet the demands of the data centers, that they are one piece of a much broader challenge that we have, which is that we need to be adding clean electricity fast enough to not only meet all of this growth and demand, but also to steadily displace the coal and natural gas that today provides about 60% of our electricity supply. And if we can't do that, if we can't keep pace with both growth and more in order to displace existing fossil generation, then we will fall far behind on our overall climate goals. Okay, with that stage, setting the stage, let's go back to here. Let's jump into the conversation. So, Lucia, I wanted to start with you. Google has some bold goals to meet basically all of its electricity consumption with clean electricity, not just on an annual basis, but hour by hour. It's 24/7 carbon-free electricity. We've been fortunate to be research partners at Zero Lab to look at what that looks like at the system level. Your team is trying to, get that power online quickly. At the same time that I'm sure you're facing very, competitive pressures to quickly expand the services you're providing in generative AI and in other areas. How do you balance that? Is there a tension there? How do you balance that need for clean electricity, which might take longer, and the need to get data centers online? And how do we sort of square that circle?
Yeah, that's the big question. And first, I want to say thank you to Jesse and the Andlinger Center team here for hosting us and being such partners on our journey to 24/7 carbon-free energy, or 24/7 CFE, as we call it. It's been super insightful to work with you all. It's given us the insights we need to understand energy systems and also our role in accelerating the decarbonization of the grid as a corporate. Right? As you mentioned, Google has some very, very ambitious climate goals, and that includes a net zero emissions goal across our operations and value chain by 2030, and also this 24/7 CFE goal that you mentioned, which means we aim to operate on clean energy every hour of every day in every grid in which we operate. And we talked a lot this morning already about the potential for AI tools to accelerate the energy transition, to provide tools for tackling our climate challenges. And I would argue, the topic of this panel, power for AI, that side of the equation is not just a negative, right? That can also be an incredible tool to accelerate the energy transition. So we think about that work on the energy supply side in a couple of different ways. First, as a purchaser, right? We are working to quickly accelerate the deployment of renewables. Just last year, in a single year, we contracted to bring online 4 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's the most we've done in a single year, and we're not stopping there. But we know that, and you've seen that in your modeling, Jesse, where to really achieve grid decarbonization, we can't stop at wind and solar alone. So we know, a second piece of our work has to be around how can we accelerate the commercialization of a set of advanced technologies that we know we're going to need in the decarbonized grid. And that includes technologies like, clean, firm generation technologies, advanced nuclear, geothermal, CCS, as well as advanced energy storage technologies, a set of grid technologies, right, to firm up our renewables portfolio, as well as unlock capacity on the grid. And that's really my passion. My team is really responsible for helping to accelerate those advanced technologies. Just in the last couple of months, we've done a couple of exciting deals. We scaled our involvement with Fervo, an enhanced geothermal startup, from a pilot stage to a sort of full commercial-sized offtake via our partners at NV Energy. We signed a very innovative and exciting biomass and CCS project in Singapore, which is a very clean energy constrained market. And most recently, we were very excited a couple of weeks ago to announce our partnership with Kairos Power to deploy up to 500 megawatts of new nuclear capacity in the form of advanced nuclear SMRs. So those are just a couple of examples of the types of work we do. I'll sort of end by saying that's all supported by also some very innovative market development and policy work, which is essential. A good example of that is the groundwork we've tried to lay via something called the Clean Transition Tariff, or CTT, which is really a utility tariff. This is a little wonky, but it's a utility tariff structure that allows us to pay for utilities to invest in accelerating some of these clean, firm technologies and doesn't put that cost on the ratepayer. We did that in the case of NV Energy with geothermal, but we hope to see that scale sort of across the board in the US and also with innovative market development efforts abroad.
Yeah, one of the things you're trying to do, it seems, is pull forward in time demand for the technologies that we'll need really to get to 100% carbon-free grid everywhere eventually, but you want that now. And so that's going to really put the pedal to the metal to accelerate some of these technologies as quickly as we can go, and the sort of market environment and purchasing environment that you need for that. So it's really potentially catalytic work. So Matt, we're going into this period of growth in the electricity sector that, again, we haven't seen in roughly 20 years. I have to imagine that's sort of fundamentally changing what some of the investment outlooks look like in this space and kind of the strategy there. So can you talk about what do you think are some of the most promising ways that we can meet this demand in maybe the next 5-year window, between now and 2030, say, and then the sort of medium term beyond that?
Yeah. So first off, just to give a little bit of context on our firm, Energy Capital Partners, we're the largest private owners of power and renewables in the United States. We've been around for about 20 years, and we're a value-add infrastructure fund. And a big part of what we do focuses on additionality. So meeting new demand for the last 5, 10, 15 years, that's mostly been building new renewables. And for a while, that was just as delivered wind, and then it was as delivered solar. And then the last few years, it's been firmer, with batteries. We built some of the largest solar and storage fields out in California as an example. As we look forward, I think the big thing that's changing with this new demand environment, first off, it's making the additionality point so much more important. We need to add new electrons, but we need to add firm and reliable electricity to do the things that these largest tech companies in the world want to do, or just the base case, which is residential, commercial, industrial load. It's all firm load. We have to supply it. And if you talk to utility executives, the trope I've gotten from someone who's mentoring me from that background is, hey, when the lights go out, people die. And it's just not acceptable not to have reliability as a first and foremost point on what we're focused on. So when we're looking forward now, look, going to 2, 3, 4% demand growth CAGR for 15, 20 years is massive. And the thing that's different, we have the same baseline, and even EVs or the built environment, that's all the same sort of dispersed demand growth. And I'm used to that, sitting in this seat for the last 16 years of looking at here's where demand's going, and then how do we play it? What's new is actually the AI side and the data center side. We've never had, at least not in my experience personally, I wasn't around for watching new smelters get built, I guess, where you have these single massive loads getting built where it's 1,000 megawatts or now 2,000 or even 5,000 megawatts when we talk about, the next GPT cluster that needs to get built. It has to have, yes, you can build it anywhere, I suppose, and we're talking about that today, but it has to be within a certain radius. These GPUs need to be able to speak to each other. You need to have your stop points. You need to have a real plan that works with the grid. So what's new for us is that massive large load story. And for us, we're big investors in power. Now we want to be big investors in data centers. And we're working on very large partnerships to do that, where, if the biggest impediment for the biggest companies in the world meeting their strategic goals is power, bringing solutions to places where, it's wonderful. For 5 years, we were told you're never going to get into data centers because it's all in Northern Virginia. It's a great feeling to say what we've been suspecting, which is eventually it's going to have to come, demand's going to have to come to supply. And that's happening to existing supply. But now where new supply is getting built, it's a coexistence with that new demand.
Yeah. What are some of the generation technologies you think are, how much can we do with wind, solar, and batteries here, and what's coming down the horizon after that we need?
Yeah, I think a ton, right? If you look at the last year, we did 60 some odd gigawatts of new supply, and vast majority of it is wind, solar, and storage. And we're thrilled to continue that. We have a lot of businesses distributed in utility scale. Pivot Energy was mentioned in the morning's keynote as one of our 7 or 8 different companies that do this. And when I think about the different types of technologies, we have our plays there. It's all capital formation is really robust. We can finance those things very efficiently. There's lots of demand. There's efficient markets for talking to people like Lucia about what their needs are and meeting them. As we go forward, I think it's going to be, the long-term solution. I'm a climate optimist as well. I firmly believe a big chunk of this is going to be nuclear in the 2030s and 40s. That's my firm personal belief. I think in the near term, though, it's going to need to be more natural gas in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, because, I don't think the U.S. is going to stand by and have just demand that's not met. And I think it would be a shame, frankly, to lose our edge in AI to places like China that will not have the hindrance be power. So, look, natural gas is going to be part of this solution. Am I or am I not talking my own book? We obviously do invest in natural gas as well. I don't know, but I firmly believe it. It has to be part of a mission critical goal, has to be to see where the U.S. can continue to lead. And if this is the biggest hindrance and gas is the solution here, let's bring some carbon capture technology to high cap factor plants in the Gulf Coast, in the Gulf Coast. Or, let's start to tackle, solutions where we can to kind of use co-firing and do some of the things you mentioned on hydrogen.
Yeah, and of course, with natural gas plants, the things we worry about from an emissions perspective or an air pollution perspective all hinges on how much gas we actually burn, right, not necessarily how much capacity we have installed. And so one of the challenges, I think, will be to figure out how we can minimize the use of any gas capacity we do add. Of course, we're also going to have to retire about 100 gigawatts of existing coal-fired power plants if we want to be on track for our climate goals as well. That's a big chunk of firm capacity need as well. So, Allison, maybe on the optimistic side, there's 1.5 terawatts of renewables in the queues waiting to connect to the grid. There's over 1 terawatt of storage alone. And this is as of the end of 2023. So here we are in October 2024. There's probably another 0.5 terawatt of additional resources that have been added to the grid. If you just, if you assume that everything gets built, which probably won't happen, I'll come back to that in a minute. That's just to put it in scale. That's enough to provide about 4,000 terawatt hours of new generation. That's all current electricity supply in the U.S. And of course, 1 terawatt of storage at meeting peak demand. That's about the peak demand of the U.S. So this is just a massive amount of new potential supply. Now, not all of those will simultaneously get built, but what those queue positions do indicate are projects that renewables developers and storage developers have acquired land control. So they know that they have leases and they have lease positions, and they think that they have a high chance of developing an economically competitive project. So, the land is there, the economics are there, and yet we're not clearing anywhere near the scale of resources we need to get onto the grid. So you've been at the front seat at FERC over the last few years. What do we need to do to sort of unlock those floodgates and make sure that we can meet this demand growth primarily with these kind of clean resources that are stacked up and waiting to get built?
Well, thanks, Jesse, and thanks for having me. The Net Zero Lab does so much important work to try and influence federal policy where I see it, and it's nice to hear also private sector decisions. And what was striking to me from this morning's conversations is how quickly 1,000 times increase in efficiency for 3 times increase in energy, and the system that has to facilitate this change has increased in efficiency, has improved efficiency so little over the same time period. And in fact, hasn't changed very much in how the electric grid has operated for the last 60 plus years. So it's a really striking challenge. When it comes to how do we get these resources on the grid, FERC, the agency, which I was one of 5 commissioners, has jurisdiction over what resources sign up for and retire from participating on the grid. And over the last decade, 2 decades, what has happened is as this 1.5 terawatts of generation have gotten in line, it's just overwhelmed the interconnection system. The interconnection processes weren't designed for anything other than kind of central station, dispatchable, most recently gas plants, combined cycle gas plants, peaking plants, closer to load, don't need as much network upgrades. There's lots of room on the grid because there was an investment in the grid many decades ago. But now we've got the situation where there's all these resources who want to sign up and they can't get on. This has been going on for a long time, and most of the supply resources waiting to get on today do have site control, do have the financial and commercial readiness. There's some that we're still clearing out, from the days of the Wild West where people would just sign up 6 interconnection applications and see what happened, which would cause a lot of problems for everybody else when people would drop out of those lines. So what do we do about it? FERC has passed a couple of different rules to clean up regional transmission planning. The comment about planning during this morning's session on that utilities plan so much. Well, if we had been planning for an increasingly electrified economy 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have a lot more transmission, a lot more space on the grid to give access to these resources. We have taken action as an agency to try and fix that through one rule. We've also taken action as an agency to try and fix the interconnection lines themselves through some nuts and bolts requirements to make it harder to get through. So you don't come until you're ready to go. But those rules of policy changes that are very positive aren't going to have impact for, let's say, 5 years, 7 years. I mean, the reality is we're not going to be picking new transmission lines from these processes we've developed until at least 2029. It's 2024. What do we do for the next 5 years, right? Even these really exciting new deals with SMR, advanced geothermal, we're looking in the 2030 timeline. Well, the existing grid is really inefficient. And if we can use AI to improve it, that would be really, really important in validating and making this a positive cycle of affirmation. The last thing I'll say is what are those inefficiencies? The lines between regions, the lines between PJM, which is the region we're sitting in today, a grid operator, and the New York State grid operator and the New England grid operator. At the interties, the transfer are very inefficient, and they're often counter to good economics. We have no hardware and software solutions, grid enhancing technologies, advanced transmission technologies that can automatically double existing capacity or existing room, extra room on the grid. We have surplus interconnection. We have the opportunity to put more resources behind existing points of interconnection and use that system more efficiently. So the reality is, to solve the power for AI, we need the AI to come back and help us do it.
We'll hear more about that later today. So I want to drill down on some of the forecasts for demand growth here, because they're sort of all over the place. And maybe Lucia, will start with you, but curious everybody else's perspective as well. We had everything in our forecast from sort of the low end is what the Energy Information Administration has in their current annual energy outlook, which they're sort of taking this year off. They did last year. They're taking this year off in order to update some of their modeling. So we won't get a revised estimate from the EIA for a while. But probably clearly undercounting the trends as the things accelerate in the last 18 months or so. On the other hand, we've got folks, talking about 50 gigawatts of interconnection requests in a single utility service territory, right? Which is just, enormous. So where do you sort of see the more realistic corridor here? And how do we kind of prepare for that scale of growth? And is this a real step change from what we've seen over the last, say, decade of demand growth in the sector?
Yeah, I always fear this question. I always get this question.
Give me your crystal ball. Yeah.
Quite frankly, I think it's a really, really hard question to answer, because there is just so much uncertainty in the system at the current moment. And, we're going to continue to find exciting new uses for AI that are going to increase the demand for those services. But at the same time, we're also going to see efficiencies, right? And as we saw in the expansion of internet services, as we saw in the transition to cloud, we're going to see enormous efficiencies that sort of counterbalance the energy demands of those additional services. And so I think, where we ultimately land in terms of the path of growth is anyone's guess. But I will say, as you mentioned in the opening, right, data centers are part of the picture, but we should all be prepared for an increasing sort of electricity demand environment across the board. In terms of, what we do, I talked already a little bit about the energy supply side of the picture. So maybe here I'll touch a little bit on the efficiency side, right? I think there are enormous efficiencies to be captured, and that's sort of at every single level of scaling AI and machine learning deployment. So at the sort of model building level, right? We've already seen at Google we've tested and implemented processes that allow us to train our AI and ML models at 100 times less the power consumption and 1,000 times less the emissions. And we've started to implement those in our day-to-day. Moving out from the model sort of on the compute infrastructure, right? We're also seeing incredible strides on that front. Our TPU v4 is 2.7 times more energy efficient than our TPU v3. And then stepping out a step beyond that at the data center level, right? We're also seeing incredible efficiency improvements there. Just in the last 5 years, we've seen a 4x improvement in sort of the translation from energy inputs to compute power. And so I think we're going to continue to see that progress. We're going to continue to see that those efficiencies stack.
Yeah, it seems like maybe there's been some, conventional wisdom that the efficiency gains are slowing down in sort of the sector. And part of that is that we're sort of, I think, optimizing the sort of thermal management of these data centers, which is a huge piece of the overall energy demand. But, the last panel was talking about how, GPUs are a general purpose technology, right? They're invented for graphics processing, not for training AI models. And so the sort of opportunities to optimize the hardware, to optimize the software, seem like they really can give us, a lot more headroom there in this sort of new field of demand for AI and large language models. Just for context, the IEA had an excellent sort of presentation on, or a set of graphics on demand. So the International Energy Agency noted that from 2015 to 2022, which is like a 7-year period, demand for internet services globally went up by something like 7.7, nearly 8-fold. Demand for data center loads, that's mostly cloud, services and serving video and things like that, went up by like 4.5-fold. And total demand across all data centers, excluding crypto, went up by about 50%. So again, sort of 10xing, the service supply with only a 50% increase in demand, and that was over a 7-year period. And so this is an unprecedented kind of increase, and we've been using more and more computing for decades, and that's going to continue. It's just a new use case, and a lot of uncertainty about where exactly it goes. Allison, the FERC conversations, like how is this filtered into this sort of shift into a kind of a growth mentality, filtered into conversations on the regulatory side? As it sinks in, like how does it change the perspective about some of the regulatory trade-offs that we're used to?
I'll be honest, I was part of it. I was there. I think the commission got caught flat-footed, as did the industry, the regulated utility industry. I think as did to some extent, maybe not the most sophisticated hyperscalers, but certainly a lot of these tech companies who are just now realizing they're also energy companies.
Right.
And on the low growth predictions front, I'm a lawyer, so I get to punt on being actually technically correct. But to me, we're going to be wrong. Whatever we think it is, we're going to be wrong, and it's not going to be even around the country. And the timeframes for low growth are going to be different. To me, it's getting the system right. The sun and wind are abundant, right? We just need the interconnections across the country and the ability to store the power in ways that allow for that wild abundance of fuel-free, fuel cost-free, what I meant, power to get it done. So the commission is starting to realize that this is what the commission has to deal with. They're holding a technical conference later this week, actually, to talk about co-location of resources, which is a big issue for data centers, and that should be pretty interesting. But I would say regulation just lags the markets at all moments in history, and at this one in particular, it's pretty daunting to think that I was on the commission for 4 years. It took us 4 years to put out a rule to fix regional transmission planning. It took us 3 years to put out a rule to start to fix the interconnection queue problem. We still haven't done interregional planning. We still haven't really finished by a long shot increasing the efficiency of the existing grid. And here are the markets running off, trying to take care of business, but getting stuck because of these regulatory changes. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. So I teach an intro to the electricity sector class here in the spring for Princeton students, and the back half of the class is all about regulation. And I always introduce in this way that, the sector, regulation has to co-evolve with technology and often acts as a brake on the pace of technological innovation in this sector, unfortunately. And so we need our regulators to be just as innovative as the technology companies and everything else. So appreciate the work you did on the commission. I want to come back to sort of the reliability piece of this. So, data centers, are unique or different from other kind of load growth in a couple of ways. One is that they're these potentially very large centralized loads, especially for the training side, gigawatt scale data centers. Similar in some ways to, electrolysis or large scale industrial electrification that we might also need to be prepared for. But very different than EVs or, heat pumps, which are just sort of distributed everywhere and have quite a bit of flexibility, especially EVs. Like when we decide to charge our vehicles can be very flexible, across days and even weeks. Data centers are running pretty much 24/7 and they have to have a high degree of uptime. And they're very large concentrated loads. So how do we think about meeting that reliability challenge? I want to sort of circle back to the role of gas, but also some of the other solutions that might be there and on-site power, right? Because most data centers have some degree of on-site power. So maybe Matt, I'll start with you again and kind of think about what is the solution set that you're looking at for the reliability side, and kind of how do we put together a portfolio that can meet that need?
Yeah, sure. So I would start by talking about what does co-location or on-site mean. There's almost every data center in the whole world relies on the grid as its primary source of reliable supply.
Yeah.
Let's start with that. And it'll have backup generation, uninterruptible power supply from a very short duration battery and a diesel backup generator. That's the model. That's been the model for a long time. There's only one, data center of scale that I know of, which is the one that was built AWS or is being built by AWS at Susquehanna, the nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, where it's primarily looking at the units, 2 nuclear units. They're not both down ever, touch wood, I should say. But it gets into Allison's comment on, we're going to have a big technical conference on Friday. It's about this. Can you really rely? Do microgrids work? Are there black start, ancillary services, other things that are needed that are not being reflected and other stakeholders are left holding the bag? Okay. It's a big question. At the same time, even the utilities don't love that, because are they actually serving the load? Are they selling? That's their business plan. So there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of complexity there. What you are seeing for other co-located sites, 3 Mile Island is an example of that. Mm-hmm. 3 Mile Island is not supplying the power solely. There's going to be a connection to the grid in that one. And we're working on things behind the meter where you might be co-located with a gas plant, but it's really about the grid's, average carbon intensity that those data center players are looking to. And there might be a power purchase agreement where you're buying from a natural gas plant some period of time for the inducement to build on the site to get the land lease. But the big thing I want to leave you with, though, is we're probably going towards more of that latter bucket of, yes, they're getting located together, but for the largest tech companies in the world to keep adding new data centers, they're going to have to play ball with utilities, regulators, and others and say they're good citizens of the grid. I think utilities are going to end up serving a lot of that load, even if it is co-located. And I think you're still going to be looking at the grid as a primary source of power. And, will there be some bridging? There'll be some bridging. There'll be some N+2 reciprocating engines or aeroderivative units that you plop down, and you don't even have to answer the question of what the hell happens in 2032 with greenhouse gas, because you can move the thing, right? There's going to be things like that are happening, but the big picture is still going to be, it's the grid's the grid. Like, we're going to have to still have answers where, until we get to some massive islanded off $80 billion campus somewhere in West Texas, we'll see if it happens. But I don't think it's going to be, by and large, what we're talking about.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So the data centers themselves might be sort of base loads in the sense that they're kind of always on, but what drives our capacity needs is the overall peak in the system. And many places that peak is still very much kind of a needle peak that's driven by air conditioning loads in the summer or, electric heating in the winter, depending on what region you're in. And, so it might only last for a few hours at a time. What opportunities do we think? How are you looking at demand flexibility in Google's portfolio, along with things like storage? Can you go unlock other demand flexibility to sort of compensate for data centers? Is that something that Google's seeing as part of the 24/7 portfolio? And to what degree can you actually drop demand at the data centers themselves? Like how flexible can they be during these periods of grid stress? Because what we found in our modeling is that meeting a 24/7, every hour of the year kind of load, the 100% reliability is not just a little bit harder, but a lot harder than meeting a 95% or 98%, firm kind of load where you can drop, demand in a few hours of the year.
Yeah, and not just harder, a lot more expensive.
Yeah,
also.
a lot more expensive, exactly.
This is a question we think about a lot. I think before I go and answer that question, I did want to also pick up on something that Matt said here. From the Google perspective, we don't intend to take, existing power on the grid, existing clean power on the grid, and divert it directly to our data centers and sort of take that away from the other users on the system. And I think one thing that we're really committed to on the reliability angle is to have a positive impact on the grids in which we operate. And so I think in thinking about all of these problems, we are committed to working very closely with our utility partners. And I think that's the big change that has to happen from a market structure point of view, right? We can't just show up and operate at some kind of arm's length with our utility partners. We really have to get together and figure out how we solve these problems together. And that includes using a broad portfolio and bringing online a broad portfolio of generation assets together. But also that includes the sort of demand flexibility and demand response piece. Now, internally at Google, we have lots of programs starting to look at this question. And as you mentioned, the AI ML load is still something new that we're all wrestling with, right? And I think there's a lot to be learned there. That AI ML load, I think, certainly comes with some substantial flexibility in terms of geographically and temporally that I think will allow us to have some demand flexibility and demand response to offer the system. And then at the same time, in addition to working with our utility partners on bringing online generation sources, we also want to work with them on demand response on the broader grid, right? For consumers, deploying virtual power plants and that kind of thing. So some of these new market structures that I've talked about, the CTT, the Clean Transition Tariff, are a way for us to also invest in those programs.
Allison, is there anything you wanted to add on the demand flexibility side?
Absolutely. I mean, the resources is just so untapped. And when I started working on these issues 20 years ago, I was a demand side advocate, and I find myself saying the same thing still and saying, well, I'm obviously not going to work on my messaging. It's not going very well. The reliability question is really hard, and this idea that you have to make sure that everybody else on the grid continues to get power puts the utilities in a really tough spot right now. I mean, they are feeling it, and they want to have these partnerships with customers. We have to be very careful, though, that reliability doesn't just mean combined cycle gas turbines, because we have a lot of commercial, to Lucia's point, we have a lot of commercial technologies that can make up a reliable portfolio. Mm-hmm. So in the Southeast, between Dominion, Duke, and Georgia Power, they've proposed 14 gigawatts of new gas in the last year because of this industrial and data center development. They also happen to be the region of the country who's lagging when it comes to energy efficiency. Yeah. There are actually still demand side resources. There are still low-hanging fruit there. And so this opportunity to get creative and do it quickly is really important, because otherwise we are looking at a big overbuild of gas. And that isn't the worst thing in the world if they're sitting around providing backup, although it might be for customers' wallets in that utility territory. But, if they're starting now to make combined cycle units that they're planning on running a lot, that's a different conversation.
Yeah. So I think this brings us to the nuclear question. There's been a couple of really recent deals, both to bring existing, recently retired plants like 3 Mile Island back online to co-locate with Susquehanna in the case of the Talon Amazon complex, and projects with new early stage, technology companies that are bringing new reactors to market. Obviously, there's only a handful of plants we can restart. There's basically 3. 2 of them are already on track, and we'll see about the third one, which is in Iowa, I believe. So it's not really a scalable solution, but those are gigawatts of power each. So getting them back on the grid is certainly a big boost of clean supply. Let's talk a little bit more about sort of what role next generation nuclear reactors can play here. Obviously, they're not going to get built in the next 2-3 years. The sort of timeline is a bit longer than that. So maybe let's just to make that concrete. Let's talk through the timeline of what Kairos is planning. How do they go from where they are now, which is trying to build their, I think, started construction recently of a test reactor, to delivering on the, I think, 500 megawatts that that Google wants to buy from them in the 2030s.
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, nuclear is absolutely part of this broader portfolio of technologies that we think we're going to need. And fully, recognize that new nuclear build tends to take a little bit longer. I think one of the things that is exciting for us about the advanced reactor space is that with these SMRs, there's not only sort of inherent safety and efficiency features, but also an opportunity to start to build them a little bit faster and deploy in a more modular way. And one of the things we really liked about our partnership and working with Kairos is their pretty unique approach to sort of iterative deployment. They built an experimental test unit. One, they've taken that apart. They're currently building the second test unit down in New Mexico, and then they have the first NRC construction license issued in the last 50 years on their test reactor Hermes 1 in Tennessee. So they're going to start to break ground on that, and then very quickly following that, they'll build a first sort of powered reactor, and we're looking to bring on that powered reactor by 2030. And we have this pipeline to bring on additional reactor units up to 500 megawatts by 2035. So I think that is already a pretty quick timeline for our net new, advanced nuclear.
Yep.
I think in the meantime, though, there's lots of other opportunities. The restarts you mentioned, but also life extensions. We should absolutely be doing extensions
and uprates.
Existing fleet uprates. I think there's some real opportunities. Looking at some examples from Europe, of doing some larger uprates, and we should make sure we capture all of those opportunities in the U.S. fleet.
Yeah, squeeze as much as we can out of the existing resources. That's the only way to go quickly in the near term. But I do think it's one fine point on this that the Kairos deal is talking about delivering 0.5 gigawatt by 2035, right? So we've got 10 years effectively to do that, and that's half of one large data center, right? So there were multiple companies in the space. Maybe they can each bring 0.5 gigawatt online by the mid 2030s, but it really isn't the solution, right? I think there's a bit of a in the kind of broader discourse around this, like a bit of an overplaying of the role of nuclear in meeting this sort of demand growth. Like it's going to be a piece of the puzzle, but just the timelines to get to large scales are going to be long enough that we're going to need a much bigger pool of technologies. And that's where demand flexibility and advanced geothermal, long duration storage, gas with carbon capture, whatever it is that we can use to sort of meet that demand growth, we're going to have a big portfolio. I want to talk a little bit before we go to audience questions about permitting and permitting reform. So we talked about interconnection. That's one, I think, of the principal barriers to getting clean electricity supply on the grid quickly is how quickly can you connect to the grid. But of course, we have to build that grid out in order to connect more resources. And we have to permit nuclear power plants. We have to permit wind and solar facilities. We have to permit all of this energy infrastructure. So if we're moving back into a world where the power sector has to build at scale to meet all this growth and demand, how important is it that we revisit permitting processes? There's a bipartisan bill that's pending in Congress right now to sort of put this front and center. And one of the big I don't want anybody to necessarily endorse or comment on the specific bill, but one of the big pieces of it is an effort to give FERC more authority over interstate transmission siting, planning, and cost allocation, something that hasn't been addressed by previous orders. And I think, as I understand it, is not really something FERC can do under current statutory authority. So Allison, I wanted to get your thoughts first on kind of like how far have we come with the recent FERC orders, and do we still need legislation to give FERC, more authority on that front, in your opinion?
I think we absolutely need legislation, and I'm unemployed, so I can endorse the permitting bill that's out there. No one's gonna.
There you go.
I'm spending a lot of time talking to my friends from environmental NGOs who don't like the fossil fuel provisions. And, in a perfect world where we could start from whole cloth, we would only focus maybe on the electric transmission, but that's not the world we live in. And I think it's a good compromise. It does two important things. It does what Jesse just said, which is give FERC clearer authority over planning and cost allocation for interstate transmission lines. We arguably have that authority. I think we very much have that authority, but this gives both political cover and requires us to do a stronger role than we'd probably do of a compromise across 5 commissioners with different perspectives. It also gives FERC real backstop siting authority. So if you have a interstate transmission line that goes from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Ohio doesn't want it, a year after the developer puts that line in for application, they can say, okay, thanks Ohio for not acting for the last year or rejecting it. I can take my whole line to FERC. And if it satisfies a set of criteria in the bill, which are called national interest criteria, which most transmission for some time will, then FERC can provide the siting and related ability to go get eminent domain authority for those lines. That's how natural gas pipelines are currently sited. It's a lot easier to build a natural gas pipeline in the country, believe it or not, as hard as that is, than it is to build electric transmission. So,
and this is such an odd quirk of history, as we were talking about over dinner last night. If you look at any linear infrastructure of national importance, right, highways, railroads, pipelines, right, everything but electric transmission, the federal government is front and center, right? I mean, the Interstate Commerce Clause gives gives the federal government, the authority to engage in regulation and economic policy around things important to the national, interstate commerce. Electricity transmission would clearly be one of those things. FERC has some authority, of course, over regulation of interstate transmission, but not siting. Right, siting has to go through the state level. And one of the things that's actually I found really interesting as I was sort of looking into this is that dates back to a 1935 amendment to the Federal Power Act, something that created the modern FERC. That also is the same year that that Congress passed the Public Utilities Holding Companies Act, which was part of a kind of a broader push that FDR and the kind of New Deal era had launched to break up these huge interstate holding companies that had come to dominate about 75% of the electricity sector in America at the time. And they were exerting huge political power at the state level. So the state commissions were kind of getting rolled over by the lobbying, power that these companies had. They were exerting power at the federal level. And so there was a real kind of trust busting mentality there. And so there was a deliberate effort at the time to balkanize and fragment our electricity system, and to kind of push it down to a scale that states could wrestle it, into the public interest. Like that was the goal of the time. And nearly 100 years later, 90 years later, we still are living under the regulatory regime that is reflected there, which is that everything is balkanized and it's all down to the states. And it just seems to me, on a kind of an odd quirk of history, maybe it made sense in 1935, doesn't seem to make so much sense in 2024 or 2025, given the challenges that we have. And I think that kind of history is underappreciated. That like there was a reason for this. It's not just an accident. But maybe we should revisit that reason 90 years later.
And one of the unfortunate things about the politicization of renewable energy resources versus thermal traditional resources is that transmission is the backbone of the U.S. economy. It is the most important aspect of national security, international economic competitiveness, let alone our citizens' health and safety. So before we even talk about what's hooking up, there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I think we're going to go to audience questions now. And so please, just a note here that we are going to rebroadcast this panel next week as part of the Shift Key podcast that I co-host, published by Heat and App News. So if you ask a question, make sure it's on the mic and note that you are consenting to potentially having that aired. So if you don't want that, don't ask a question. You can come and chat with them later after the panel. So just, wait for the mics to come around. We have one on the end here, and then maybe the other mic can go towards the back there. Or Rob, go ahead,
Rob Sokolow, veteran of the energy efficiency discussions of 50 years ago, with a lot of sense of deja vu, asking what might be missing from the conversations from the demand side, which got a snicker a while back. What is the analog of task lighting, of lowering your thermostat? But when we are using AI, there will be a hierarchy of value for the actual exercise that we somehow can we internalize that? Can the consumer think about it? The amount of resolution in a photograph you forward, realizing that that's got a carbon implication. Am I not being heard?
Yeah.
So, I'm asking, are there analogs that we can actually invent and articulate to the demand side communication of relative value that would actually have major consequences? Was that? Yeah. Am I heard?
Yeah. Thanks. Lucia,
Yep.
start.
I can get us started. I mean, I do think there's a whole suite of products that, powered by AI, we can bring to the table here. A good example, for example, is fuel efficient routing, right? And Google Maps. That's something that can provide information to the consumer for them to make smart choices every time that they take a trip. For our corporate customers, right, we are able to offer them a whole suite of sustainability metrics in their cloud usage. And so they can actually make choices about where and how they put their load across our cloud footprint to meet their sustainability goals. So I think there's a whole suite of possibilities.
I imagine there's certain types of tasks that just can afford more latency than others. And so that gives you the potential to shift tasks around geographically. So like maybe at this moment, the grid is particularly dirty. It's hard to source new clean electricity to meet those demands. So maybe you have another half a second lag or whatever it is on the task. And I imagine many of these AI related, chat bot features could, it already goes away and it thinks for a little while before it types you an answer. Maybe it thinks a slightly longer and then you can have a bit more flexibility there. So that maybe that's another analog that you can think about.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the conversations we've been having with large AI companies, the way they've been talking about it is, hey, we maybe don't need 99.999, the traditional 5 nines of reliability that you have for cloud infrastructure for training. And the training specifically, it kind of goes both ways. The one thing they need to start doing, if they want to accept 95% availability or reliability, which would be huge for the grid, first off. If they want to get there, they have to start modeling different ways to kind of come back from stop points and break points. And when they start building that into their infrastructure, it might be more cost effective and they get it done a year, 2, 3 years faster. And when they're talking, they talk in a way that I'm finally starting to come around to the way of talking about it. This isn't a $1 trillion opportunity. It's it's a $100 trillion opportunity. And there's big stakes where winner takes all and we can't miss the 2020s. So hearing that they're willing to come down to 95% is huge. But also, if you go talk to someone in the back office in ERCOT, where a lot of this load's happening, they're going to say, well, tell me what happens when there's a accidental stop point and I lose 3,000 megawatts of demand. That's not easy either. That's a problem for grid stability as well. So they have to come with solutions both directions of maybe a little less reliability, but also good answers. And what do? Do you fire up some other task when you hit a failure point on these training models? Because we're not going to, end up procuring 100-fold the ancillary resources that we have to supply that sort of a risk too. So it's a two-way street on that.
That's a good point.
Yes. Klaus Jäger, visiting fellow here at the Andlinger Center. I wanted to come back to the question, or I wanted to ask or understand the motivation of big tech companies to put nuclear energy in a prominent role in recent weeks. The question I'm asking, that it already was mentioned at COP28 and following also at the conference in Brussels in March this year, more than 20 countries pledged to triple nuclear energy until 2050, which means roughly 4% annual growth. However, at COP28, more than 100 countries pledged to triple renewable energies by 2030, which is more than 15% annual growth and which is rather modest comparing the growth levels we have seen in recent years. So regarding these numbers, how can we understand the big motivation of tech companies for nuclear? Is it because they believe that it gives a more stable energy supply, or are there also other rationales?
Yeah, as I think I mentioned earlier, we see nuclear as a clean, firm, always on power technology that will complement renewables, right? And I think how much, and you saw our partnership with Kairos is currently focused on the US. I think there's also very much a regional aspect of this, right? There are parts of the world, for example, in Southeast Asia, there are markets in which we have very low renewables penetration right now. We have, single digit percentage renewable penetration. And in those areas, we absolutely, the first order of business is to expand and rapidly deploy renewables and battery storage that we already know how to do at scale. And we need to create the sort of market structures and development opportunities to scale that quickly. And then as you start to scale those renewable resources, you are also going to need the complement of first, the shorter duration battery storage, then the medium and longer duration battery storage, and ultimately also a complement of clean, firm technologies like nuclear, like geothermal, like CCS, in order to have a full decarbonized and reliable grid. So it's sort of all the puzzle pieces need to come together.
I mean, I think you can speak to this too, but like part of it, I think the motivation is also just having sort of a catalytic impact on the development of new technology as well, right? Beyond the sort of need to meet your data center loads, or, there's like a recognition at Google and Microsoft and other companies that, they can use the purchasing power they have, the sort of high value of electricity consumption to be able to afford a premium, and create an early niche market for some of the technologies that would otherwise, kind of struggle to compete against natural gas and kind of in a, overall general market. We don't, there's nowhere in the US where we really have 100% 24/7 clean grid yet. And it'll be many years off in the future before that demand kind of materializes more broadly, but you can kind of create that today, just like you can, create demand for clean steel or cement to build data centers and things like that. And so I think that's what nuclear, along with advanced geothermal and other technologies, that is one of the key, impacts that you're having too.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think some of our early investments and partnerships here can bring those technologies that are at a premium today down the cost curve for everybody.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I imagine we'll do a study on this, I think, but I imagine that the sort of spillover effect of, say, having the cost of new nuclear reactors or advanced geothermal and then their adoption everywhere else is probably even larger than Google's direct emissions footprint, as big as it is, right? I mean, that is a huge spillover. Question here?
Thank you. I wanted to ask, as everything is happening in the energy sector here in the US, we also obviously see in the geopolitical space wars happening and a very large increase in defense technology investments. I'm wondering on the demand side, as far as the defense sector is concerned, are you looking at dual use technologies and the application of some of the energy technologies we see for the defense sector? And specifically, Matt, when you're looking at investments, are those new models that you're willing to entertain now more than you would have in the past?
It's an interesting question. I honestly hadn't thought to the way I think about national security and the value of that governments see of having training models and the data onshore is that for the US anyway, we have the largest tech companies in the world are US companies and they want to do it here. And in some ways, in certain deployments, they're going to be required to do it here from a legislative perspective in Congress, I think. And depending on what happens, well, who knows what's going to happen in this country.
We're staring into the void.
But when I think about it versus, where compute might go in the Middle East or in China and the types of entities that are large enough to do the sorts of things that we're trying to do for what are, in a lot of ways, general purpose advancements in the way that we compute and we figure things out and we improve, on things that we as humans can't do efficiently ourselves. And so when I think about that, I just want it here. I want to see it here. I want to see it happen here. And I understand where that comes from. I'm sitting here. I grew up in Jersey. I went to school here in Jersey, and I'm sitting here in Jersey now. And I don't know, it might be a US centric view, but I think it's so important to acknowledge that is going to be a big part of it. When we talk about the next conflicts, obviously all of the weapons themselves are more technically driven. And then there's a lot of just cyber warfare and interference with the grid and information and, battles on a totally different front than we've ever tackled before. And it's so important to have this advancement here locally.
I think on the energy supply side too, there is a growing interest at the Department of Defense and to have, 24/7 reliable supplies on military bases as well, so that if the grid is disrupted, it doesn't impact things. So just as one example of that, there's a Department of Defense and Geothermal Technology Office partnership to trial advanced geothermal technologies on several different military bases. It's a lot of land in the West that the Department of Defense owns and a lot of good geothermal resource potential there. So they could also potentially play a role as they have in so many other areas as an early purchaser of advanced technologies. I mean, this is why we have cheap microchips and, lasers and GPS and everything else, is the Department of Defense often plays that role as sort of the first buyer. It's interesting that it's data centers and, and tech companies largely kind of stepping into that role voluntarily now in the energy space, but we shouldn't sleep on DoD's potential to pull in a lot of these technologies. Right, back here, and then maybe we've got a couple in the front here too for next.
Hi, Martin Franzen from Mercator. Allison, this is a question for you here. So at the White House roundtable for AI infrastructure a month ago, there was the mention of the Fast 41 rule. Can you just help us explain a little bit like how that could potentially be implemented here and what are some of the criteria? And do you actually think that it can be applied to accelerate some of the permitting and issues around authorizations for especially renewable projects and everything else when it comes to solving for the power for AI?
Yeah, I'm going to phone a friend and see if Lucia can help me on this one because FERC didn't interact with the Fast 41 rule, so I don't.
I can do it if you want.
Great.
Yeah. So Fast 41 is an effort to streamline permitting, particularly for environmental permits at the federal level, to designate one lead, federal agency and to coordinate, environmental permitting reviews, things like that. I think that there is definitely a use case there for siting of renewables on federal lands. And for environmental impact statements for transmission lines that cross federal territory. So, a lot of land in the West and elsewhere that's owned as, national wildlife reserves or BLM land or other things, and they all need to go through these federal permitting procedures. And so Fast 41 is an effort to kind of use existing statutory authority to consolidate and accelerate things. I think the one big missing piece is that the primary siting authority for transmission just doesn't lie at the federal level, right? And so there's nothing we can do right now to speed that up because it isn't there. And so unless there's additional legislative reform that gives FERC a much more robust role in federal siting, then there's no timeline to accelerate because it doesn't sit at the federal level right now.
So I just have a quick question for Lucia. This question is regarding fervo. You mentioned fervo earlier, and that's geothermal, and that's predominantly here in the U.S. What's Google doing outside of the U.S. regarding heat, data centers, and sort of reducing that carbon footprint outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Google has a global footprint. And so if you look at our environmental report, it actually gives you a breakdown of our 24/7 CFE scores across our global data
That's
center.
carbon-free electricity.
Carbon-free electricity. Yep. That's right. And those scores actually vary quite a bit, right? So for example, Europe looks a lot nicer because there's already a lot of grid decarbonization going on there. APAC looks a lot more challenging. We have a lot of very clean energy constrained regions in APAC, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, where renewables are challenging to come by, and we are going to need the full complement of different technologies. And so we are absolutely looking, and I can't reveal exactly what's in our pipeline to come, but we are actively looking at, geothermal projects. We're actively looking at storage projects and, of course, the larger renewable projects as well abroad. Something exciting that we launched this year is a partnership with BlackRock and GP on an investment to accelerate a gigawatt of solar deployment in Taiwan. And so that gives us both the ability to decarbonize our own footprint in Taiwan and also give some of that power, share some of that power with our suppliers. And a big part of our Scope 3 footprint is also in that APAC region. Sorry?
Concentrating solar power?
Yes.
So I have not looked at that recently, but certainly these types of things all come our way occasionally.
Hi, I'm Barb Blumenthal with New Jersey Conservation Foundation. I wanted to bring the topic back locally since many of you are from New Jersey. We're part of PJM. PJM now has about 8% renewables. Generation is only 8%. I know, shocking. It's a problem, and there's an interconnection queue, not clear at what rate things will be built and when that process will be open again to new projects. So there's a huge backlog of solar projects, wind and storage, but it's going to be a race. It sounds like the rate of development in PJM and the rate of load growth, we might well see more gas generation over the next 5 or 10 years. I don't know. So do you have any new ideas? Because we've got a real problem that's for states like New Jersey that are part of the regional grid and looking at a not very optimistic outlook.
Everyone's looking at me. It's important to recognize the distinction between the vertically integrated utilities around the country who own the distribution system, the generation, and the transmission, and regions like PJM, where the majority, except for Virginia and West Virginia maybe, are restructured states that have basically handed over, their control of their own transmission systems and the development of resource adequacy solutions to the markets in the region. And so now you're talking about PJM, the grid operator, who's got all these transmission owning utility members, as well as a whole bunch of independent generation. And there's lots and lots of, because as there's only a single digit renewable penetration, most of that generation is legacy thermal, new thermal, but lots of gas. I think it's the majority by a little bit in the region now. And so how do you manage these challenges in this way when you, as the customer, can't go up to the utility who has the ability to make decisions up and down that chain, from the generation up through the transmission, and come up with solutions? And you have to rely on improving interconnection. PJM is under a lot of pressure to do that. They've put in some interconnection reform. It's some of their newest suggestions are controversial. So we'll see how that plays out. But it's a different set of challenges. And so there will be a different, toolbox for the solution set.
I think maybe a nutshell, like optimistic answer too, because I think look, if we do get some transmission from elsewhere, that's going to help a lot for someplace in New Jersey, and we hopefully will have new nuclear here, and we'll have some offshore wind. Like if I think about 15, 20 years, when we're all enjoying time down the beach, you're probably going to pass some new reactors down the parkway, and you're going to see some offshore wind farms way in the distance, not too close, but let's hope.
So I think we're going to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I did want to sort of end here, which is I think there is an opportunity here, given how important AI and data center growth is to sort of meeting economic growth priorities, to meeting, American competitiveness challenges, and energy innovation challenges, to keep putting the pressure on PJM, on the utilities, on the regulators, to figure out how we solve this challenge, because we have to be able to build at scale to meet our decarbonization challenges, to meet the broader load growth challenges, and to meet power for AI. The core of it is we have to build. We have to build. And we do not have a regulatory regime. We do not have necessarily market designs. We don't have permitting regimes that, are fit for purpose. They weren't, we've had 20 years of kind of where that wasn't the prerogative, right? The prerogative was energy efficiency, and the prerogative was, driving down costs and things like this. And I think that is a real fundamental shift. And so I hope that these sort of conversations continue out from here and keep the pressure on for solutions. Maybe we need an Operation Warp Speed for, the interconnection queue or something like that. But these are going to be fundamental constraints on economic growth on innovation and opportunity unless we can solve these problems. So Allison, Lucia, Matt, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And thanks to the audience for excellent questions.